Hi, everybody. I want to start with a story. True story. So it's about 15 years ago, and I'm in my office at the Second City. It's a Friday, it's June, and I'm kind of picking up. It's the end of the week. And my son, Nick, is finishing up his first week of Second City's summer improv camp. We had just started it. And here's what you need to know about Nick at the time. He was 10 years old. He was chubby. He has weird theater parents, so he's this weird theater kid. And he gets bullied at school. But this week has been amazing. And we get in the car, and we're leaving Second City, and Nick says to me from the back seat, "Dad, do you know what I love about improv class?" I go, "No, buddy, what do you love about improv class?" He said, "In improv, if you're nice and you're funny, you're popular." Right? That stuck with me. So I started the Second City in 1988. It was my first gig out of college. I became a dishwasher, which is not as glamorous as it sounds. The back bar at Second City in those days was filled with alcoholics and sociopaths. I'm not making that up. Side note, the other guy who got hired to wash dishes that week with me was a guy by the name of Jon Favreau, the actor and director, not the crooked media guy. We both had mullets, and there is photographic evidence in my wife's office at the Second City if you're ever in Chicago. Dishwashing, not a great gig. And I don't know if you know how the Second City is set up, but we do 2 acts of scripted content and a 3rd act that is improvised. So on the main stage at that point was Mike Myers and Bonnie Hunt and Joel Murray. In the Second City ETC, our sister stage, Jane Lynch was in the cast. Tim Meadows and Chris Farley had just been hired in the touring company. Farley was constantly getting in trouble for breaking shit. And when you're washing dishes, you're busy during the show, but for the improv set, you get to step out. And I remember thinking, just when I started, this is magic. But it's not magic. And when you work there for a while, you realize why. So I'm not going to bury the lead. Improvisation is yoga for your social skills. Okay? Improvisation is loud, noisy group mindfulness. Improvisation is a practice in being unpracticed, which is how all of us walk through the world every single day. So if that surprises you, it maybe wouldn't if you knew the origin story of the Second City, which starts in the 20s and 30s. There was a woman by the name of Viola Spolin who was working as a social worker at Jane Addams Hull House on the south side of Chicago. And her job was to better assimilate immigrant children and neighborhood children into her care. So she created all these games, these exercises, these activities that allowed the kids to come together and communicate and empathize. Many of the games were in silence or in gibberish because the kids didn't always share language. But she saw them coming together and working together, whether they shared language or not. And her son, Paul Sills, was studying at the University of Chicago, which didn't have a theater program. And he taught these games to his friends, Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Barbara Harris, Alan Arkin, among others. They formed the first improvisational theater in America called the Compass Players in 1955. In 1959, that morphs into the Second City. So, fast forward, I become the producer of Second City in 1992. My first cast included Stephen Colbert, Steve Carell, and Amy Sedaris. I hired Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Rachel Dratch, Jason Sudeikis, Sam Richardson, Keegan-Michael Key. I am gratuitously name dropping, but we all know that is why I'm here today. Let's get the guy who hired Tina Fey. Maybe he knows something. It's amazing to have a front row seat to that level of high performance and then to get into the pedagogy of improvisation because the work is amazing. So I did this for many years. I ran Second City from 1992 to 2015. And then I co-wrote a book called Yes and, thank you for folks for bringing that up a couple times. And it's a book about how we take our improvisational work into organizations to help people be more creative, more collaborative, to be better partners. I went on a book tour with that book, and that was amazing, and I will not forget. I was at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and my wife Ann and I were leading a workshop for a bunch of cool people. Walter Isaacson and Arianna Huffington were all there, all these folks. It's going very well. And I get a text during the interactive session we're doing, and I go to check that afterwards, and it was my boss basically had a question about, there was a $250 discrepancy in a budget. And somehow this knocked me over the cliff. One might call it a midlife crisis. That's probably what it was. But I ended up coming back to Second City and saying, no, I think I'm done. I think I'm done with this part. God bless them and this particular fellow at Second City, because he knew I was essentially unhireable anywhere else. But he said, hey, listen, why don't you take a year? We'll keep you on your salary. You figure out a bridge in or a bridge out. I'm like, oh, this is great. And so I moved into the best office I'd ever had at the Second City, right on Wells Street with this like alcove window down there. I had a pre-planned vacation. He said, go ahead, go to Michigan. And I'm in Michigan, and I'm putting gas in my car. And I get a text from one of my folks I work with saying, Kelly, your office is on fire. Now, I work at Second City. I'm assuming this is a bit. It was not a bit. The Great Fire of Second City in 2016 started in the upscale Mexican restaurant right below the new office. I had just moved everything I had had at Second City forever, and it was gone. We then got pushed into these temporary offices. The Regis Company, not great. In fact, we would get in trouble for laughing too much. So I don't know many companies who are anti-joy. They are. But there's something about being sort of in a cramped, uncomfortable environment that pushes you to be creative. And creative loves constraints. So we're in this cramped environment, and the guy who runs our corporate division, Steve Johnston at the time, said to me, Kelly, do you have any ideas for collaborations that you would do for us? So one of the things I was known for at Second City was all these cool partnerships. I worked with Renee Fleming, and we created Second City's Guide to the Opera with Lyric Opera Chicago. I worked with Hubbard Street Dance to create The Art of Falling, an improv comedy dance show. Worked with the Toronto Symphony to create Second City's Guide to the Symphony. And I said to Steve, I go, funny, when I was on book tour, and any author who tells you they don't do this is lying, you always go into the bookstore to see if your book is there. And I would go into the business section, I wrote a business book, and there was a book called Improvisation and the Art of Negotiation. And it wasn't very good, at least the improv part. So I said to Steve, what if we created an improv negotiation program and we found some academic partner? He said, great, go do it. So I went back to my computer and I Googled academic negotiation Chicago, and then I just emailed the first 5 academics that came up. Like, bad data research, but whatever, it's what I did. And 4 of the folks got back to me right away and said they were into it, like they wanted to do it. And then about a week later, the 5th sent a note back to me, and his name was Eugene Caruso, and he was then at the University of Chicago. And he said, Kelly, sorry I'm getting back to you so late, but if you're still interested in talking, do you want to meet? So like old Kelly would have been like, no way, like I'm good. But I'm in this Shonda Rhimes Year of Yes midlife crisis mode. So I'm like, sure, I am open to the world. And I tool up to the University of Chicago, or down, up, and he invites his wife, Heather, who's also a scientist there, and I start doing my rap on improv, and Eugene could care less, he's checking email, but Heather is locked in, and she says to me afterwards, Kelly, we're behavioral scientists, we have decades and decades of research that show us that people make bad decisions for themselves, often. And you have an art form, a practice, that would allow them to make better decisions for themselves. Those 2 things have never been put together. So we convinced her boss, Richard Thaler, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, to greenlit the Second Science Project. We did a 6-year program that looked at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation and vice versa. So the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is, yes, things I've learned at Second City and the brilliance of improvisation, but it's all evidence-based, and that's what I'm going to bring to you. So I mean, my life's work has been about the reality that leadership, business, all of this are imperfect people leading other imperfect people in imperfect systems because they were built by imperfect people. That is what we're doing here. And if we knew that, if we admitted that, we might be doing a lot better. And I'm going to make you improvise, okay? Cool. I want to lead you through, so when we first met with a scientist, they said, lead us through an exercise. And the reason I thought about doing the yes and exercise was when we sold the book to HarperCollins, it was called The Revolution Will Be Improvised, which I thought was a cool title. And we led the sales team through a workshop, and after we did yes and, they say, that's the title of your book. And God love them for doing that because it's sold very well. But I want to lead you through the yes and exercise. So the hardest part of this whole exercise will be what I'm asking you to do now, which is you need to decide at your table who's person A and person B, and if it's an odd number, you can have a person C. So really quickly go do that. This is the hardest part of the exercise. All right, so here's the premise of this exercise. I told you it was the hardest part. Okay, here's the premise of the exercise, which is this has been such an amazing event that we decide that we're going to have a reunion, this group, a reunion in 1 year. So person A, you're going to pitch your ideas for this reunion. You know, anything, where it goes on, what happens, is there a band, any of that stuff. Person B, your job is to say no to every idea. You can vary it up and say no in different ways, but you are going to negate every single idea. And we're going to do that for about a minute. And if you're pitching to a C as well, they're also negating. All right, 1 minute, go. All right. I want to ask everyone sort of a question. So for person A, and you can just shout out adjectives, how did that feel? Bad, frustrating, awkward. Okay, person B, how'd that feel? Yeah. You're bad people. You're not good people, if you enjoyed that. All right, person B. It is your time to pitch to person A and or C. Same deal. You're going to pitch this idea for the reunion. It could be completely new ideas. You could build off theirs, whatever. Person B and or C, you're going to respond always with the words yes, but. Okay? You're going to say yes. You're going to say but. Whatever follows. Do it for about a minute. Go. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come back to me. All right, I want a show of hands. Show of hands. How many people thought that was better than the first round? How many people thought it was worse? Yeah, okay, that checks. Here's the deal. If you thought it was better, it's because you heard a yes. That was not a yes. That was a no with a top hat. My wife often says that the yes but exercise is how it feels to be a woman at work. All right, now for everyone, we're going to do the same thing. And so person C and or A, you're going to start your pitch for this reunion. But what everyone is going to do is yes and every idea. You're going to affirm by saying yes, and you're going to add to it by saying and. All right, and so for this, and really for any of these scenarios, don't let budget constraints concern you. The law of physics should not be paid attention to. I'm serious. Go as far as you can possibly go with this, all right? Yes and every idea, see where you go, all right? And I'm going to give you a little bit more than a minute for this part. A and or C. But now you're all doing it because you're yes-anding every idea, right? So you're doing it collectively. Ready, go. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, come back. All right, I don't know about you, but that sounded better, right? Sounded louder. Who's going to outer space? Yeah. Why not? Sushi on the moon. Who's got U2 playing? Or equivalent band? Beyonce. Yes. Of course. Faye. So here's the deal. Here's the deal with this. Which is when we're creating a show at Second City, it's usually over a 12-week period, and we're starting from nothing. That's kind of the rule, in the sense that many of our directors have the rule that you can't bring in an idea that you pitched before. It's got to be net new inside the room with this often a new group of talent. And so the first 4 weeks, and this has been going on since 1959 when we opened, the first 4 weeks, all yes and. Every single idea gets put on the board, no matter how dumb it appears, and it is listened to. And it's not that those things all end up making it into the show. But what we know about individuals is that when you say no to their idea, you're saying no to them. That is how it feels. I give these talks a lot, and there's almost always a dude in the back, and it's always a dude, who says, if I yes-anded every idea, I'd never get any work done. So 2 things I know. That guy's a nightmare to work with. And he's missing the point because yes and operates at the front end of creativity. It is 5 minutes at the beginning of a brainstorm. All right? And I get hired a lot to talk at like creativity and innovation conferences, and people conflate the two things, and they're different. You can have creativity and no innovation, all right? You cannot have innovation without creativity. Fact. All right, innovation is messy, and it's hard. And it makes people sort of like have to share an idea that they're worried they're going to get laughed at or that sort of thing. But nothing becomes an innovation that we like knew, and that's by virtue of being an innovation. Second City has the best improvisers in the world, and even they do this. So they get in the way of themselves. Mick Napier, who's a director, longtime director at Second City, when he does his process, he always has a day during the process that he calls Taboo Day. And the idea is you have to bring in 3 ideas that there's no way in hell Second City would ever allow on its stage. It's too expensive, too offensive, too problematic, whatever. Invariably, 50% of those ideas end up in the show. It's just true. Because to be creative, you cannot be in judgment of self or others. And you can't work out of fear. And so much of what's getting in our way is when we're in judgment of ourselves and others. And that goes for the most gifted, talented improvisers, but it goes for all of us. And we have a phrase in our work that you need to bring a brick, not a cathedral. So many of us enter these conversations and we have our cathedral fully built, when in fact, we want to do it brick by brick. That's how we get to the best ideas. We also have a phrase that you need to replace blame with curiosity. Just take a beat. Take a beat to be curious. You might make a discovery. And we also know in our work that all of us are better than one of us. That's how we get to this stuff. Thank you. So this was intriguing. So we did the exercise for the scientists. And the first thing, and Thaler brought this up, which he wrote the book Nudge, he said behavioral economics teaches us that our default position is to say no or do nothing. So literally, yes and is a nudge to do differently. That's amazing. There's also tons of research around gratitude and other things that exist for yes and. But they asked the question, well, what happens when you don't want a yes and, but you got to stay in the conversation? And we're all sort of used to that tricky area. And we didn't know, we didn't have a prompt for it, and they didn't necessarily know. So they went away and looked at the literature, and we went and sort of experimented inside of classrooms. And when we came together, we kind of made a discovery. And there's a paper coming out next year based on this concept. And the concept is called Thank You Because. And the idea is if we want to stay in a conversation, but we don't really want to yes and the person, we don't agree with them, the way we do this effectively is by thanking them for the information, and then finding anything, no matter how small and what they said, that we do agree with or we find value in. So I want you to stay in the groups that you're doing right now and do Thank You Because. But we don't need to take like world problems. This is human behavior. So it exists whether it's a world problem or it's whether you disagree whether chunky peanut butter is better than creamy peanut butter. So that's one thing it could be. It could be dogs versus cats. It could be Coke versus Pepsi. Here's one. The scientists were like, no one cares about this. We're like, yes, they do. Hanging the toilet paper over or under? Right? People are very passionate about this, but the scientists at the University of Chicago thought not. So really quickly, decide what you're going to argue about. So person A and B and C, you're just going to pick a side to convince each other, but I want to give you a second to figure out what you want to do. And it doesn't even need to be something you truly believe yourself. You're just going to pick the argument. So do that. You got it? All right, everybody. So now, person A, you will start. You're pro or con, whoever's chosen pro or con. And you will try, here's what you're each going to do. You're going to try to convince the other in this first round. This is no thank you because. Don't use those words. You're going to try to just convince each other you're right. You are going to have that argument. You're going to convince each other you're right. Ready, go. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come back to me. All right. Let me get your attention again. So you've had the argument. We don't need to debrief it. We all know what that's like. So here's what you're going to do that's different in this round. So it's going to take the same topic, but your response to every initiation is going to be, the prompt will be thank you because. And so the thank you will be essentially the sort of setting off the gratitude part of the brain. And the because is just find anything. It can be, I like the tone of your voice, it doesn't matter. Anything that is of value or that you do agree with in their position. And you're going to do that with each other, and you're going to see where it takes you. Okay? And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Come back to me. Okay. So that is different, right? Did you learn something about the person? Yeah, isn't that funny? You're talking about peanut butter and you learned something about the person. This paper, which probably, we built this thing like 4 years ago. One of the reasons the paper is taking so long is we put tens of thousands of people through this exercise where both parties did the thank you because, and overwhelmingly, people said they stayed in the conversation longer, they learned more about the person, and they found a place, if not of compromise, of agreement in terms of moving forward. But we decided to have it, we wanted to do the same amount of people where just one person did it. Still worked. It's cool. We talked about Nick. Nick's little sister, Nora, was about 4 years younger than him, and she got diagnosed with cancer when she was 16, my daughter. And she was at Lurie Children's Hospital, and anyone who's been through this sort of understands you just have so many different doctors coming through and nurses, and they change all the time. And what you really desire is for your child to be seen. My wife helped create this exercise, and so what we would do in the hospital room was when a new healthcare provider would come in, I'd say, hi, I'm Kelly, this is Anne, this is our daughter Nora, we've worked at Second City for 30 plus years. Nora also goes by Eleanor, and we have a Bernese mountain dog by the name of Benchley, who's an asshole. Who are you? And guess what? They told us. And they would share details of their lives. And I remember one time Nora had the doctors were on rounds, and at a certain point they all had their phones out to show pictures of their dogs. And so they saw not kid with cancer, they saw Nora. And they knew about her, and so when we'd have emergencies or other kinds of situations, they knew her, they knew us. It was easier to sort of decide what to do. It's a very powerful concept. It's knowing that this was Indigenous Peoples Day, and in a week, 2 weeks, I'm going down to talk to my friend Crystal Echo Hawk, who works for a company called Illuminative. So they work a lot in Hollywood they worked on reservation dogs around Indigenous stories. And I found, yeah, awesome, right? And I found this quote that she quoted, it's from an Apache tribe. The proverb is, it is better to have less thunder in the mouth and more lightning in the hand. Is that great? So part of the reason we get into these situations is that we're so bad at communicating. And I mean all of us, me included. One of the academics that we worked with and continue to work with at the University of Chicago is Nick Epley. Nick has written this amazing book called Mind Wise. And his research is about the many different ways that we misunderstand situations or don't communicate situations. In fact, he opens the book with a joke. He says there's a man who comes up to a riverbed and he sees another man across the river and he yells, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And the man yells back, "You are on the other side of the river." I love that the only joke I tell is from a scientist in these presentations. But it's true, and Nick did a lot of research around this. He actually sent graduate students out onto buses in Chicago, onto the South Side, to have conversations with strangers. And before they went out, they had to fill out a document that talked about, like, how bad do you think this will go? And everyone's like, it's gonna go terribly. And then uniformly it came back, and it was the opposite. People got into interesting conversations. They made friends, that it was not so bad, because we're reluctant to share details of ourselves. We just are. I'm not going to make you do the exercise, but the exercise that my wife created around this is called Universal Unique. And we pair two people, and we say, person A, just tell person B how human beings grocery shop, generally speaking, and they do that. And then she says, okay, now in the next round, talk about how you grocery shop. World of difference. Complete world of difference. So when our ability is not to talk about who we are in a sort of meaningful way, it really gets into a problem area. And so my life in improvisation and comedy as well is that specifics are your friends. I mean, Seinfeld wasn't funny because it was vague. It was hyperly specific, and people said about nothing, but actually it was more about nothingness, the things that we all deal with all the time. So my wife is she runs the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance. She is a tenured professor of comedy. She is every parent's nightmare. But one of the things that she teaches in terms of her experience is this difference between stand-ups and improvisers. And when improvisers are doing their work, they do perspective taking. So we'll come to the audience for suggestions and then take those and then bring those back out to you. Stand-up comics need to do perspective giving. They have to teach you how to watch them. So if you think about your favorite stand-up and think about them at the beginning of their career, maybe their first special, in the first 5 minutes of their act, they're talking to you about something that's wrong with them. Patton Oswalt is a schlub, Amy Schumer is a slut, John Mulaney's a drunk. I could keep going on. But they're locating you in this moment because in reality, people do not want to hear your success story. They want your fiasco, and they want to see that you have lived through it. Our friend Sunil Gupta, I host a podcast called Getting DSAN for WGN Radio in Second City, and I interview a lot of academics and thought leaders. And Sunil is an entrepreneur. His brother is Sanjay Gupta. But Sunil was famous for, he had this idea for this health app, and he went out for funding and got no funding. And then one day he was called up by the New York Times, by this convention that said, hey, will you come speak at our convention? He's like, yeah, absolutely. Well, the convention was called FailureCon. And the next day in the New York Times, there was a big picture of Sunil talking at a dais with a banner that said failure over his head, because he had failed. But it led him to then research what it was that made people not be backable. To not have people want to play with their ideas. And he tells this story in the book about a young girl who lived in a very poor town. It's a border town between Pakistan and India. No electricity, no running water. They had one generator for a light, and she had one book, which was a biography of Henry Ford. And so as a little girl, she just dreamed of being an engineer. And her parents somehow saved enough money to put her on a ship, and it was the first time she had left the village, to go to college at the University of Oklahoma, and this is in the early 60s. And so she is graduating, and she sends a telegram to the Ford Motor Company to get an interview to be an engineer. And they set up the interview time. She has an unusual name, so they didn't know she was a woman. And she shows up at the door of the hiring manager. He takes one look, and he goes, we've never hired, and we're not hiring any female engineers. And she's about to leave, and she decides to turn around and tell him her story about the border town, the book, the generator. And she says, I know you've never hired a female engineer, but what if you and I made history today and you hired me as your first one? It's 1966, he hired her, that was Sunil's mom. That was also the story that got him the funding for the RISE app. Because people were connecting to his story. Because, we come from all different kinds of places, but we are someone's child, right? So there's a reason I start the story about Nick, and I talk about Nora, and I talk about my family, because at least maybe you don't know anything about improv or comedy, and you don't care, but we're a daughter, we're a son, we're a brother, we're a sister, we're a child. That's the thing we have in common. A lot of things that hold us back, too, in this work, in addition to judgment of self, judgment of others, and fear, is how we hold on to stuff. There's a cognitive science by the name of Irving Yalom, and he had a quote in a book that just killed me, which is, he says, sooner or later, you have to give up the hope for a better past. Right? Man. Because we hold on to that stuff, right? We live in these, we ruminate in the past, or we live in an imagined future. And the reality is we need to play the scene we're in, not the scene we want to be in. That's what we have to do. And it is not easy. And we are our own storytellers. my wife Ann and Sunil collaborated at Northwestern at the Farley School for Entrepreneurship to offer a class about where you used improv exercises to teach people how to be backable. And these kids had never taken a storytelling class. And I know a lot of us don't think we're necessarily good storytellers, or we probably think more like we're a bad storyteller. You're not necessarily. You just haven't had the practice. We have an exercise called 60-30-10, so this is something you can do, where we have people describe who they are in 60 seconds, who they are in 30 seconds, now do it in 10 seconds, and sometimes do it in a hashtag. And it requires you to really get to what's important. I had a playwriting teacher who once said to me, you don't have a play unless you can tell me what it is in one sentence. And I love that, and that's something that's really, really useful. And these were engineering students that we're working with, and they'd never been in a position where they'd been asked to tell those kinds of stories. I know we're talking about collaborations, and so I wanted to tell a couple of those stories of partnerships, because I think it is Second City's core philosophical pedagogy that allows us to be such good partners. But the story around how the opera thing happened was that the box office got a call from the Four Seasons, and they had a very important guest who was staying there who wanted tickets for a show, and this person in the box office is kind of new. And the two stages I mentioned, the main stage and the ETC, they're equal in terms of talent, but the main stage is the original, and that's where normally we would send the celebrities, and this person didn't know, so they put them in the ETC. So when Renee Fleming and her husband and daughters came to the ETC show, they saw a show that was illegally sampling her voice throughout the entire thing. And she, at the end of the performance, goes up to Jesse Case, our musical director, who's sweating like the guy in Airplane, the movie, and she's like, I'm not interested in suing you. I want to have a conversation. And they kept a stack of my cards there, and he's like, you got to call this guy. But Renee called me, and we had coffee. And she was talking about looking around the audience at Second City, and it's like, I want opera to have this audience. And I had sort of just recently moved into the position of the work I was doing in the academic work, and I said, well, look, I'm totally interested in this, but it's going to take like a year buy-in. This is what the thing I knew, like we can't just like do this. We're going to need to, we got to learn who you are, you have to learn who we are, we have to fail together, and turns out opera, not very interested in that, but they did. They agreed to it because I have Renee Fleming. And so over the course of a year, we would attend workshops, and they would attend shows, and we would try out material. Sometimes that material would bomb, and I kept having to saying, this is part of the process. Trust the process. We're all good. And eventually it started to kind of come together, and we could all see it. And so we announced that we were going to do this first ever gala performance of the Second City Guide to the Opera at the Civic Opera House, and Renee got Sir Patrick Stewart to be her co-host. So, but he couldn't rehearse with us until the day before. So, like, Second City's cool with this. Like, this is our, like, bag. Like, everyone else was like, how are you going to make this work? And we're like, we got it. And we had faxed him scripts for the things that had scripts. But then we were working with a group of Second City performers who also were part of a group called Improvised Shakespeare Company. They put on fully improvised Shakespeare plays. And so Sir Patrick comes to rehearsal, and we're like, hey, we're so curious whether you want to do this, improvise with our cast. He said, let me see what you do. So I was like, okay, just give us a suggestion. They gave one word. And then they did this incredible 20-minute improv Shakespeare piece. And Patrick Stewart goes, you're mad, and yes, I'll do it. So the show goes great. There was one minor hitch. The lyric opera people had told one of our actresses, Carissa Barreca, she hates it when I tell this story, and I'm going to keep doing it. They said, all right, you can, when you're going for suggestions, just one row to stay apart. Don't go to this row. It's like bankers, people who've paid for this. We just don't want anything to go wrong. And this was like during the economic crisis. You see where I'm going with this? So Carissa, of course, goes to that group, gets the banker, Joe, who, as he's being interviewed, is like, no, everything's great. I mean, it couldn't be more tone deaf in terms of what was going on at the time. And the cast skewered him, including Patrick Stewart, where he died in the show. To make everything right, we just told Carissa to find that guy and tell him he was the star of the show, so it worked out. But I remember afterwards, we're all sitting around, it was a huge hit, and Patrick Stewart, we're having beers, and he says to me, you know what was amazing about this and the course of my career is I don't get afraid anymore. And I was afraid. And it felt great in terms of that. And this was just one of the most unlikely partnerships. And I know my wife does a thing with both her casts that she directs at Second City, but also with her classes where she makes covenants before the show of like, okay, what can we collectively agree that we believe in as a group? That's going to be our covenants. And we know this moving forward, and then we can really effectively and pro-socially call each other out if we break the covenants. But then if something else comes up that wasn't part of that, we have to give everyone a bit of grace. We have to give everyone a bit of gratitude and a bit of space. And since she's been doing that, it's been incredibly effective. I got just a couple minutes left. One more quick story and something I did the other day that I want to share with you. Sunil Gupta's book, Backable, has another great story in it about a primatologist named George Schlatter who was studying apes in Africa in the 50s. And he was renowned for getting closer to the primates and accumulating more data. And there was a woman at a conference who raised her hand and was like, how do you do this when no one else can? And he said, oh, it's easy. I don't carry a gun in my backpack. Right? And we all know those people who have the gun in their backpack, whether we see it or not. I found that was a really amazing story. Okay, so my kids went to Chicago Waldorf School, and I got asked the other day to come work with the senior group that's all going to be doing their presentations. And so I got together and I led them through some exercises, and I decided to write down 10 things I wish I had known as a high school senior. And I'm going to share these as my last bit with you. So number 1, be early or at worst on time. Number 2, if you find yourself reluctant to ask a question because you're afraid of looking dumb, ask the question. Number 3, the only thing I truly regret are my acts of unkindness. When you make a mistake, say you're sorry. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. One note, you are also likely not the smartest person in the room. Life doesn't get easier, but you can develop the skills, muscles, and emotional maturity to weather the difficulties that life will present you. If you're having a bad day or feeling sad, do something nice for someone else. No one gets to the end of their life and says, I wish I had worked more or spent less time with the people I love. Never stop being a learner. Read, attend, ask, be present. And my last one was, every generation thinks the next generation is softer because they are. And that's a good thing. We should strive to make it easier and better for the next generation and not be bitter that it was harder for us. Thank you.